In 1988, a researcher barricaded his own house with sandbags and put a loaded .45 under his pillow. He was protecting his family from something he called the visitors. 3 years later, in a West Virginia hotel room, a journalist was found dead in the hotel bathtub, his wrists cut nearly a dozen times. He had been chasing a conspiracy he called the Octopus. Officially, these are unrelated tragedies. One man lost his mind, another lost his life. Different men, different investigations, different reasons for their fall. But trace both stories far enough back and the same machinery starts working against them. This is the story of two men who had nothing in common, except for the same wall they both hit. Albuquerque, New Mexico, late 1979. Paul Bennewitz stands on the second-story deck of his home in Albuquerque's Four Hills neighborhood, looking south towards the Manzano Mountains. And tonight, he's watching a war. Behind him, his home laboratory hums, oscilloscopes spike, tape reels turned. A custom-built antenna array points directly towards the Manzano weapons storage complex, which at the time was one of the nation's most sensitive nuclear weapons facilities. Night after night, Bennewitz records bursts of electromagnetic activity. He photographs strange lights maneuvering over the base. He fills reels with thousands of feet of film and hundreds of still photographs, convinced he's documenting something extraordinary. But Paul Bennewitz isn't an amateur with a camera. He holds a master's degree in physics and founded Thunder Scientific, a successful company that builds precision temperature and humidity calibration equipment. His customers include NASA, the US Navy, and the US Air Force, among numerous others. He served in the Coast Guard during World War II and is an accomplished aerobatics pilot and devoted husband and father. And besides a love for Wild West novels, he has few consuming interests outside of his work. Well, except for one. Paul's into UFOs. For years, Bennewitz has been a member of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, even serving as a scientific consultant. When reports of cattle mutilations began spreading across New Mexico in the late 1970s, his curiosity deepens. In September of 1979, he and his wife Cindy began seeing multicolored lights flying in odd patterns over the small mountain range inside of Kirtland Air Force Base, about a mile from his home. Bennewitz begins pointing his instruments towards the sky, and what starts as a curiosity quickly becomes something far more serious. In no time, his home turns into a small intelligence station. And Bennewitz isn't simply photographing lights, he's tracking their movements with direction-finding equipment, recording radio transmissions, measuring electromagnetic activity, and writing software to analyze everything he intercepts. Believing he's uncovered a national security threat, he does what a patriotic citizen thinks he's supposed to do. He tells the US Air Force. Over the next 2 years, he invites intelligence officers into his home to inspect his equipment. He briefs Brigadier General William Brickshear on his findings. Eventually, he compiles a formal report, Project Beta, and he sends it to the Air Force Intelligence, New Mexico's own senators, and even President Ronald Reagan. And instead of dismissing him, what happens next is incredible. They take him seriously. August 10th, 1991. The Sheraton Hotel, Martinsburg, West Virginia. Around noon, housekeeping enters room 517 to a scene so disturbing that one of the maids reportedly faints. In the bathtub lies Danny Casolaro, naked, his wrists slashed 10 to 12 times. To the Martinsburg Police Department, it's a straightforward suicide. Submerged beneath Casolaro's body, there's an empty beer can, 2 white plastic trash can liners, and a single razor blade. Although the bathroom is covered in blood, the room outside is neat and orderly. On the desk, a note apologizes to his family and reads, "To my loved ones, please forgive me, most especially my son, and be understanding. God will let me in." To the police, the case was closed. But for the people who knew Danny Casolaro, nothing about that room fit the man. Casolaro grew up in McLean, Virginia, the son of a respected obstetrician. He was an amateur boxer, a breeder of purebred Arabian horses, and a devoted father who had won custody of his son after his marriage ended. Professionally, he wasn't known for chasing conspiracies. He had built a small company publishing specialized computer industry trade newsletters. In 1989, he sold it. He stayed on briefly for the new owners, but struggled with the loss of independence, and he was eventually pushed out. He was still looking for work when a former colleague, Tony Miller, tipped him on to the company called Inslaw. Their dispute with the Department of Justice over their software product PROMIS was exactly the kind of story that Danny knew how to follow. In the weeks before arriving in Martinsburg, the straightforward shape of Danny Casolaro's life began to dissolve. His friend, Ben Mason, recalls witnessing Casolaro receiving threatening phone calls the days before his death, warning him to back off or you're going to die. And according to an article in the Village Voice, Danny's neighbor and longtime housekeeper, known publicly only by her first name Olga, answered the phone that day to a string of threats. One was particularly chilling. I will cut his body and throw it to the sharks. Danny told his brother that if anything happened to him, it wouldn't be an accident. He left for West Virginia carrying a brown briefcase filled with notes, traveling to meet a source he believed held the missing piece of his investigation. Two things disappeared from room 517. The first was forensic. Police never preserved the bathwater or secured the drain. That eliminated any future opportunity to examine what may have been washed away. The second was professional. Casolaro's briefcase and the investigation it contained was never recovered. And the wounds themselves raised questions. Don Shirley, the paramedic that responded that day, remembers 8 cuts on the left wrist, 4 on the right, deep enough to sever the tendons. When he picked the arm up, he said, the wrist basically flopped. His own read on it, you cut your tendons, you can't hold something. That's a simple fact. He found it hard to believe the official ruling, given what he'd seen in that bathroom. And he wasn't the only one. To his family and friends, the official ruling was incomprehensible because they couldn't reconcile the man they knew with the death they were being asked to accept. Back in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Paul Bennewitz had definitely made an impression. During his presentation to the Air Force, Bennewitz asked for financial help to continue his investigation. Dr. Lehman, the weapons lab director in the room, told him to apply for a USAF grant and offered to help him fill out the paperwork himself. Later, according to Greg Bishop's research for the book Project Beta, another intelligence organization, likely the NSA, reportedly granted Bennewitz $75,000 for a related research study. Whether he actually received it, Bennewitz himself never said. But either way, the Air Force was engaged with helping Bennewitz in his research. Officers visited his home. They examined his equipment. They listened to his recordings. They encouraged him to continue. And the deeper Bennewitz dug, the stranger his world became. The signals he intercepted no longer sounded like military traffic. They became messages. The lights over Kirtland were no longer unexplained. They were invaders. The investigation spread beyond Albuquerque to Dulce, New Mexico. There, Bennewitz became convinced an underground facility housed an extraterrestrial presence, working alongside human collaborators. Each new discovery seemed to confirm the last. At one point, even Richard Doty, an Air Force OSI agent working closely with Bennewitz at the time, claims he pulled him aside and told him to stop. Just stop and go back to your family, Doty says he told him. I'm saying this to you as your friend, not as an agent. But Bennewitz didn't stop. Most people tell Bennewitz's story as the tragic collapse of a brilliant man. But Paul Bennewitz didn't retreat from reality alone. He had help finding that path. By the summer of 1990, Danny Casolaro's search into Inslaw led him to the company's owners, Bill and Nancy Hamilton. Inslaw had been contracted by the Department of Justice to build PROMIS, an early relational database that let investigators cross-reference cases, names, and aliases across agencies. PROMIS connected the dots that used to sit in separate files. The DOJ's contract with Inslaw was for 3 years, but after a little over a year, the payments stopped coming, nearly $2 million worth, and Inslaw was pushed into Chapter 11 protection within months. Although the Department of Justice blamed Inslaw, citing higher-than-expected costs and a failure to deliver the software on time, the Hamiltons believed the Department of Justice had stolen their software outright. A federal bankruptcy judge agreed, ruling the government obtained PROMIS through trickery, fraud, and deceit. The Hamiltons won nearly $7 million in damages from the Department of Justice, but later had that decision overturned by another court. 3 months after his ruling, the judge on the Inslaw bankruptcy case lost his seat on the bench, the only federal bankruptcy judge removed that year. He was replaced by a Justice Department attorney, one who had argued the case against him. It seemed like the cards were stacked against the Hamiltons. But Inslaw was already building PROMIS for the US government. Why not just pay for it? Why not let them finish the job? Why steal the software? The Hamiltons believed this wasn't a billing dispute, and Bill Hamilton wanted to know where the software had gone. He started working closely with Danny Casolaro, sharing what he knew, hoping Casolaro could find the connection that he was missing. Then a piece of the puzzle found him instead. A man named Michael Riconosciuto reached out to Bill Hamilton, claiming he knew exactly what had happened to PROMIS because, he said, he'd personally modified it himself. Hamilton didn't trust him easily, but Riconosciuto seemed to have an intimate knowledge of PROMIS's source code, and it was hard to dismiss him. A recorded call captures just how unsettled Hamilton actually was. Describing Riconosciuto to a former NSA contact, he's warned, "I don't know how you heard that name, but you can get killed just for knowing it." Hamilton shared what he knew with Danny Casolaro, and Casolaro didn't rush to print any of it. He picked up the phone. He contacted Riconosciuto himself. Riconosciuto wasn't chasing Danny Casolaro either, at least not by his own account. "I'm getting calls from this reporter," he said, "and he's nosing into things." But Riconosciuto started sharing what he knew with Casolaro. And Casolaro's own brother put it bluntly, saying Michael seemed to insert himself into many of the avenues Danny was looking into. Neither Hamilton or Casolaro fully trusted Riconosciuto. Both kept talking to him anyway. In 1960, when Riconosciuto was 12, the Tacoma News Tribune dubbed him a tech prodigy. He'd wired a private telephone network connecting 13 of his friends and began experimenting with underwater microphones. By 16, he'd built his own argon laser, impressive enough to land him a research post in a Stanford lab, under a physicist who'd later go on to win a Nobel Prize. But Riconosciuto had his troubles too. By 24, he'd been arrested and served 2 years in federal prison for building an underwater drug lab in a Duwamish River boathouse, reachable only by swimming beneath the surface and up through 2 trapdoors. Casolaro started calling Riconosciuto Danger Man in his own notes. And Danger Man had a story bigger than stolen software. He told Casolaro the PROMIS scandal traced back to the 1980s election itself. Ronald Reagan's campaign, he claimed, made a secret deal to delay the release of American hostages in Iran until after the election, the October surprise. In exchange, he said Earl Bryan, a Reagan associate, was handed the rights to sell PROMIS worldwide, engineered with a secret backdoor for U.S. intelligence. "I was asked to modify an existing software and develop a trapdoor," Riconosciuto said. "They wanted to sell PROMIS to other governments and spy on what they were tracking, so that's what I did." Whatever the truth of it, this was no longer a story about stolen software. And the deeper Casolaro dug, the less it looked like a separate scandal. It all looked connected. And at the heart, there were 8 powerful people. One organism, 8 arms. He called it the Octopus. Indio, California, the Cabazon Indian Reservation. In the early 1980s, Cabazon occupied an unusual legal space. As sovereign tribal land, it operated under a different legal framework than the communities that surrounded it. That made it an attractive place for an unusual partnership between private industry and the federal government. One of those partnerships involved the Wackenhut Corporation. By then, Wackenhut had become one of America's largest private security contractors, trusted to protect nuclear facilities, defense installations, and other highly classified government sites. In California, Wackenhut entered a joint venture with the Cabazon Band of Mission Indians. But according to Michael Riconosciuto, they weren't working security for a casino. It was here Wackenhut, whose board of directors include Bobby Ray Einman, former director of the NSA and deputy director of the CIA, reportedly tested high-powered railguns and detonated fuel air explosives, vacuum bombs. But Riconosciuto claimed something else. He claimed PROMIS had been modified there. According to Riconosciuto, the Cabazon Reservation sat at the center of a hidden intelligence network, stretching far beyond the California desert. Whether those claims were true remains deeply contested, but one detail wasn't. Wackenhut was there, and 10 years earlier, Paul Bennewitz had been describing something remarkably similar from another corner of the Southwest. Underground facilities, military security, restricted weapons programs, human collaborators. Bennewitz never named Wackenhut. He didn't have to. Years later, researchers revisiting his files noticed that Wackenhut held legitimate security contracts at several of the highly classified facilities surrounding his investigation. To them, Bennewitz's unnamed military security suddenly had a name. Whether that conclusion was correct is still debated, but it adds another layer to our story. On March 21, 1991, Michael Riconosciuto stopped speaking in rumors. He put his claims on paper. Riconosciuto signed a sworn affidavit describing how he said the PROMIS software had been modified into an intelligence tool and he agreed to cooperate with investigators examining both the Inslaw case and the broader allegations surrounding it. It was the strongest step he'd taken yet, and the riskiest. 8 days later, federal agents arrested him on charges of manufacturing methamphetamine. Riconosciuto insisted the arrest wasn't about drugs. He said it was retaliation for what he'd revealed. Federal prosecutors said otherwise. To them, he'd simply been caught operating another drug lab. Journalists who encountered Riconosciuto struggled to place him. Some thought they'd found the most important whistleblower in the investigation. Others believed they'd met an extraordinarily gifted storyteller. Even Jack Calhoun, a journalist working alongside Casolaro, later admitted Riconosciuto wasn't an easy man to trust. Neither was the story he told. At one point, Riconosciuto told Danny Casolaro he'd managed to throw a tape over the embankment during his drug arrest. Evidence, he said, that would prove he was threatened by the Department of Justice to stand down. Casolaro went looking. 2 days after the arrest, on Easter Sunday, Danny Casolaro flew to Seattle. That evening, Riconosciuto called him from jail with cryptic directions to where the tape could be found. For the rest of the week, Casolaro drove the back roads around Puget Sound, by daylight and by night, searching muddy ditches along the highway for a cassette tape he never found. In his own notes, he wrote, "Did the tape ever exist? Or was Danger Man testing how far out on this limb I was willing to venture?" On his last day in Seattle, he visited Riconosciuto in jail, and he told him he doubted the tape existed at all. He followed it up by saying, "I hope for your sake I'm wrong." He watched something in Riconosciuto go quiet. Casolaro later wrote that in matters that mattered most, Michael was unspeakably alone. Riconosciuto's story was full of holes, but some of the names, the places, and the connections around them kept checking out anyway. By then, Danny Casolaro had a decision to make: walk away, or keep following a source whose credibility had become almost impossible to separate from the investigation itself. He chose to keep going, because if Riconosciuto was telling the truth, the theft of the PROMIS software was only a tiny piece of what the story was actually becoming, and following it would lead him to that hotel room in West Virginia. Up to this point, these are two separate tragedies. One man lost his mind, another man lost his life. Different worlds, different investigations. But lay their stories over one another, and the same shape starts to emerge. Both men found something real and got handed a wilder story to chase instead. Both were surrounded by people who claimed to be helping them, officers who kept the door open, sources who kept feeding them just enough to stay hooked. Both spent their final years wondering how much of what they were being told was true, and how much was designed just to keep them looking in the wrong direction. And both, in the end, were left alone with what they'd discovered. Bennewitz in a house ready for a war only he knew was coming. Casolaro in a visiting room, watching a source go silent rather than answer a simple question. Two men, two machines, running the exact same patterns. But what if someone was investigating the investigators? Las Vegas, Nevada, July 1st, 1989. The Grand Ballroom at the Aladdin Casino is packed for the annual MUFON Symposium. Bill Moore, one of the most respected names in UFO research, takes the stage. He was billed to answer a damning claim by Robert Hastings, a fellow investigator who had just accused him in the MUFON Journal of working for the government. The audience expects a rebuttal. They get a confession. Moore admits that for nearly a decade, he's been an asset for the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, ordered to report on his peers and feed Paul Bennewitz a steady diet of fake documents and psychological triggers. He says he agreed to it believing it was his only way through the gates of government secrets. The irony being, the system had promised him the very truth it was trying to hide. Moore admitted he had used people, and he had been used himself. The room erupts. Stanton Friedman, a nuclear physicist and Moore's own longtime collaborator, is as blindsided as everyone else in the room. Bill English, a former Green Beret captain and former NSA intelligence analyst, runs for the exit, shouting that he's going to get a fire hose. Moore's confession didn't just cost him his credibility. It proved the well had been poisoned. Everything he'd ever written about, Roswell, MJ-12, all of it was now under scrutiny. Truth, disinformation. There was no longer a way to tell which was which. And this is the social death of the investigator. The loop closed. And one thing was certain. Whatever Bennewitz originally discovered, no one was looking at it anymore. Back in Martinsburg, West Virginia, officially Danny Casolaro's case was over. The medical examiner ruled his death a suicide, case closed. But medics on the scene that day still questioned the amount of blood, where it was, and the wounds themselves, tendons severed, wrists that basically flopped. Those still don't sit neatly with the official ruling. And the questions didn't disappear. The Martinsburg police sealed Casolaro's case file at the request of the Department of Justice. In 2013, a journalist, Christian Hansen, filed a Freedom of Information Act requesting it. He was denied, year after year, for over a decade. The request only went through when a records clerk looked at a closed case file with nothing classified in it and couldn't find a reason to keep it sealed any longer. Inside were phone records, witness statements, crime scene photos, and a composite sketch the public had never seen. One witness, Mary Lanehart, was staying in the room next to Danny's that weekend with her husband. She told police she saw a man with dark hair enter room 517 using a key. She was certain of one thing: it wasn't the man she later saw on the news, reported dead in the same room. Police asked her to put it in writing. She did. Then nothing happened. Her daughter recalled decades later, "We never heard anything ever again." Filmmakers Zachary Treats and Christian Hansen, working through the newly released files, tried to match the composite sketch to a man named Joseph Cuellar, a U.S. Army Special Forces intelligence officer who specialized in psychological warfare. And they were far from certain. Holding the sketch next to Cuellar's photo, Hansen asks on camera, "Is this Joe? Or is this vague enough to look like anyone you want it to be?" What's harder to explain away is Cuellar's own paper trail. In the FBI's investigation files, his first statement places him in Panama the night of Casolaro's death. A later report from the same agents placed him in Washington, D.C., about 90 minutes from Martinsburg. According to Treats and Hansen's reporting, Cuellar had become acquainted with Casolaro in the weeks before his death, and he had traveled with him to the very meeting Casolaro had come to West Virginia to attend. That very meeting that was supposed to hold the missing piece of Casolaro's investigation from an unknown IRS source. Cuellar's own son would later describe his father's profession simply: his job was making people believe whatever he needed them to believe. None of this was established by the original investigation. It lived solely in Treats and Hansen's reporting, built from files the government sat on for decades. What we do know is this: there was a second autopsy that found Casolaro in the early stages of multiple sclerosis, a detail the official narrative used to suggest a motive for despair. We also know Casolaro was in real financial trouble. He'd taken out balloon notes on his home to fund his research, and they were all coming due at once. And the publishers he'd approached for a book advance kept asking for more proof before they'd commit. Danny was running out of time, and he was running out of money. And if his source in Martinsburg never materialized, some people believe that alone explains what happened next. And maybe it does. But it doesn't explain the method, or the missing briefcase, or the man in the sketch. And just like Bennewitz, those questions have survived long after the investigation has ended. Biltmore's confession at the 1989 MUFON Symposium answered one question. The deception was real, but it left another unanswered. How did it work? By the time the Air Force first visited Paul Bennewitz's home in October 26, 1980, they had already reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Bennewitz wasn't a fraud. He'd built sophisticated equipment capable of intercepting real classified signals and photographing sensitive military programs operating around Kirtland Air Force Base. He'd even written his own software to decode the strange electronic signals he was receiving. His code was so sophisticated, it was able to decode sensitive NSA encryption systems that were being tested at Kirtland. Simply confiscating his equipment risked drawing even more attention to what he had found. So they took a different approach. Years later, Richard Doty, a special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, acknowledged that Bennewitz was deliberately fed false information designed to steer him away from classified military projects. The goal wasn't simply to lie. It was to build an entirely new reality. Bennewitz received false top-secret documents describing projects like Aquarius and a shadow organization known as MJ-12. Then came the centerpiece, a new computer. Bennewitz believed it would improve the software he'd already written. Instead, it decoded the same intercepted signals into a horror story. Legitimate radio traffic became messages from extraterrestrials. Ordinary military pulses became warnings of an alien civilization. Each new translation appeared to confirm the last. The number of our crashed saucers is 8, military of the US making humanoids. To Bennewitz, this was a direct line to the invasion. In reality, it was a well-engineered honeypot, and the deception extended beyond the computer. Bennewitz's attention was gradually drawn away from Kirtland and towards Dulce, New Mexico. Bennewitz was a licensed pilot, and when he began flying his own reconnaissance over the Archuleta Mesa near Dulce, OSI staged a show. According to statements from Richard Doty, OSI airlifted old military equipment onto the mesa. Storage tanks, engineless jeeps, equipment shacks, a Potemkin base complete with fake air vents suggesting an underground facility beneath. And according to Greg Bishop's account in Project Beta, they used searchlights with rotating lenses to project saucer-shaped shadows onto the clouds, while coordinating with Army Delta Force training missions in the area. It wasn't just the recordings or the fake messages. They wanted Bennewitz to see his aliens. And he did, night after night. Bennewitz found something he shouldn't have, and the system decided the most efficient way to protect a military secret was to destroy a private citizen. By August of 1988, after 8 years of unrelenting stress, and at the age of 61, Paul Bennewitz had hit his breaking point. He barricaded his windows with sandbags and slept with a loaded .45 under his pillow to protect his family from what he called the visitors. His family finally committed him to the Anna Caseman Mental Health Facility in Albuquerque. When Doty heard, he rushed to visit him. He claims he still considered Paul a friend, even though his job had been to lie to him for years. Paul had spent years talking to a rigged computer, hunting monsters the Air Force built for him out of his own beliefs. They could have seized his equipment. They could have arrested him for intercepting classified signals. They could have simply told him to stop. Instead, they spent years building him a private reality. But there's another read on this, though, one that doesn't center on Bennewitz at all. Author of Mirage Men, Mark Pilkington, argues the operation was never really about one man's radio equipment. It was aimed at the wider UFO research community around him, a community that was already digging through government documents and lingering around secret bases. Pilkington believes it's possible Soviet intelligence had infiltrated that community too, hunting for exactly the kind of classified programs, like the stealth program, that were being tested at Kirtland at the time. If he's right, Bennewitz wasn't the target, he was the conduit. But either way you look at it, the question isn't why they went this far. It's what kind of institution finds this easier than the alternative. In 2012, the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act was quietly signed into law. To the public, this was a dry update to information policy. Forensically, it represented a structural shift. The original Smith-Mundt Act of 1948 let the United States use public diplomacy, or propaganda, on foreign audiences, but it strictly prohibited directing those same tools at its own citizens. The law recognized a fundamental danger. A government allowed to manipulate its own people's perceptions eventually loses the ability to tell them the truth. In 1985, Nebraska Senator Edward Zirinsky drew that line into law. In his words, the American taxpayer certainly does not need or want his tax dollars used to support U.S. government propaganda directed at him or her. But by 2012, the system argued that in a world of global digital networks, the line between foreign and domestic audiences has become impossible to maintain. The solution wasn't to stop the manipulation, though. It was to remove the ban. The psychological warfare Richard Doty ran on Moore and Bennewitz, the staged events, the fake documents, the manufactured private reality, whether you believe the government's justification or not, the idea that a legal boundary separating propaganda operations from domestic audiences became less rigid, that should give us some pause. The state no longer needs to censor a secret. It only needs to shape what counts as credible and what gets dismissed as noise. The firewall that earlier generations of lawmakers believed was essential is no longer where it once stood. And whether that makes us safer or simply easier to manage, that's now a question every citizen has to answer for themselves. So where does that leave us? We set out to solve a mystery. Instead, we found a different one. At first, the pattern seemed obvious. A physicist and a journalist, two different investigations, both eventually touching the same machinery, the same organizations, the same shadows. But somewhere along the way, the investigation changed. We learned that Paul Bennewitz wasn't simply following evidence. Someone was helping him. The documents, the computer, the staged events, even the world around him. The investigation itself had become part of the operation. That doesn't mean every conclusion drawn from Bennewitz's work was false. It means every conclusion now carries a new question. Where did it come from? From Paul Bennewitz? or for some reality someone else built around him. Danny Casolaro faced a different problem. His sources weren't machines, they were people. Some may have been whistleblowers. Some may have been storytellers. Some may have been both. He spent the last year of his life trying to separate one from the other. He never got the chance to finish. Maybe that's the lesson. Not that institutions keep secrets. Every institution does. The real danger begins when the evidence itself becomes part of the battlefield. Because once that happens, every document becomes suspect. Every witness becomes uncertain. Every investigator begins wondering whether they're following the truth or following a trail someone else wanted them to find. Paul Bennewitz never got to know where his investigation truly ended. Danny Casolaro never got to finish his. Not because the questions were impossible, but because once an investigation is contaminated, it can never be completely clean again. So what kind of institution finds that easier than just keeping a secret? Maybe one that's learned hiding the truth is difficult, but burying it in noise is not. And maybe that's the most effective way to bury a secret, not by hiding it, but by surrounding it with so much noise, it becomes impossible to hear the truth.